The morning sun broke through the dense tropical clouds over New Guinea on July 26, 1943, painting the jungle canopy below in shades of emerald and gold. At 14,000 feet, the twin engines of 10 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings hummed in formation, their distinctive twin-boom silhouettes cutting through the humid Pacific air. Leading this small group of American fighters was a 22-year-old pilot who just 2 years earlier had been working on his family's farm in rural Wisconsin, population 300. Richard Ira Bong adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon with eyes that had learned to spot movement in these skies the same way they had once tracked deer through the North Woods back home. The radio crackled in his headset. Intelligence had reported Japanese aircraft in the area, a lot of them. What Bong didn't know yet was that within the next 30 minutes, he would face a formation of 20 Japanese fighters. What the Japanese pilots didn't know was that they were about to encounter someone who would redefine what it meant to be a fighter pilot. But to understand how a quiet farm boy from the middle of nowhere became the most successful American fighter pilot in history, we need to go back to where it all began, to a small farming community where the loudest sounds were the wind through the wheat fields and the distant call of wild geese heading south. The making of an unlikely warrior poplar, Wisconsin, in the 1920s was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where handshakes meant something, and where hard work wasn't just expected, it was survival. Born on September 24, 1920, Richard Ira Bong was the eldest of 9 children in a household built on Swedish immigrant values and American pioneer spirit. His father, Carl Bong, had come to America from Sweden as a young boy, bringing with him the quiet determination that would later define his eldest son. His mother, Dora, was Wisconsin-born, strong and practical. Together, they had built a modest farm from nothing, raising their growing family in a small house surrounded by fields that demanded attention from sunrise to sunset. Young Richard, who everyone called Dick, learned early what it meant to work. Before school, he'd be in the barn. After school, there were fences to mend, equipment to maintain, animals to feed. The machinery on the farm, temperamental and requiring constant attention, taught him patience and problem-solving. When something broke, you didn't wait for someone else to fix it. You figured it out yourself. But even as his hands worked the soil and repaired the machines that kept the farm running, Dick's eyes were on the sky. On clear days, when the occasional aircraft would pass overhead, a rare sight in those parts, the young boy would stop whatever he was doing and watch until it disappeared from view. There was something about the freedom of flight, the possibility of it, that captured his imagination in a way nothing else could. His fascination wasn't just idle daydreaming. Dick approached his interest in aviation the same way he approached fixing a broken tractor, methodically, thoroughly, with a hunger to understand how things worked. He read everything he could find about aircraft, about the principles of flight, about the pilots who had fought in the Great War. The other kids in Poplar knew Dick as quiet, almost shy. He wasn't the type to boast or draw attention to himself. In a town of just 300 people, he somehow managed to blend into the background. He was dependable, hardworking, and unremarkable in all the ways that small-town America valued. No one looking at this tall, thin teenager mucking out stables or hauling hay would have imagined that one day he would be standing before a general, receiving the highest military decoration his country could bestow. When Dick graduated from high school, the world was changing in ways that even the isolation of rural Wisconsin couldn't ignore. War was spreading across Europe and Asia. The United States wasn't involved yet, but many could see it coming, like a storm building on a distant horizon. Dick enrolled at Superior State Teachers College, but his heart wasn't in teaching. When he learned about the Civilian Aeronautics Authority training program, everything changed. Here was his chance. Here was the door to the sky he'd been watching all those years. He threw himself into flight training with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything else. His instructors noted his natural feel for aircraft, his calm under pressure, his ability to think 3 steps ahead. When he received his pilot's license, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was validation of every hour he'd spent watching the sky, every dream he'd harbored while working those endless farm fields. In February 1941, still months before Pearl Harbor would drag America into war, Dick Bong applied for the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. When he was accepted in May, his family gathered to see him off. His father shook his hand firmly. His mother tried not to cry. His younger siblings looked at him with a mixture of awe and worry. He was leaving Poplar, leaving the only world he'd ever known. But in some way, he was also carrying it with him. The work ethic, the humility, the steady determination that came from generations of people who built something from nothing, from student to maverick. By the fall of 1941, Aviation Cadet Bong was deep into flight training, and his instructors were beginning to realize they had someone unusual on their hands. He wasn't flashy. He didn't talk much. But when he climbed into a cockpit, something changed. The shy farm boy disappeared, replaced by a pilot who pushed boundaries with a calm precision that was almost eerie. After completing advanced training, Bong was commissioned as a second lieutenant in January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor had transformed the nation. The attack had awakened something in him, as it had in millions of Americans. This wasn't just about flying anymore. This was personal. His first assignment was as a gunnery instructor at Luke Field in Arizona. For most pilots, this would have been a safe, respectable posting. For Bong, it was frustrating. He hadn't learned to fly to teach others in the desert while a war raged across two oceans. But he did his job, and he did it well, absorbing everything he could about aerial gunnery, tactics, and combat flying. When he transferred to Hamilton Field near San Francisco, something happened that would change his life. He got his hands on a P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that would become his weapon of choice, his partner, his instrument of destruction. The P-38 was unlike anything else in the sky. With its distinctive twin booms, central nacelle, and tricycle landing gear, it looked futuristic, almost alien. It was fast, heavily armed with 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, and it had the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Most importantly, it could take punishment and keep flying. Bong took to the P-38 like he'd been born to fly it, but his enthusiasm sometimes exceeded regulations. On more than one occasion, he performed unauthorized aerobatic displays over San Francisco, including one memorable incident where he flew under the Golden Gate Bridge at high speed, and another where he buzzed a house so low that he reportedly blew laundry off a clothesline. These stunts caught the attention of General George C. Kenney, but not in the way Bong might have feared. Kenney saw potential in this quiet farm boy who transformed into a daredevil in the cockpit. When Kenney took command of the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, he personally selected Bong to join him. In September 1942, Bong boarded a transport bound for Australia. He was 22 years old, had never seen combat, and was heading to one of the most brutal theaters of the war. The Japanese controlled vast territories across the Pacific. Their Zero fighters had established air superiority in most regions, and Allied forces were still reeling from months of defeats. Bong was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, known as the Flying Knights. They were based in Australia, waiting for P-38s to arrive. The waiting was agony. Every day brought news of more losses, more ground given up, more pilots who didn't come back. To gain combat experience, Bong and other 9th Squadron pilots were temporarily attached to the 39th Fighter Squadron, which was already operating out of Port Moresby, New Guinea. They flew the older P-40 Warhawks while waiting for their P-38s, getting a taste of what combat in the Pacific really meant. New Guinea was hell with humidity. Dense jungle stretched in every direction, mountains rose like walls, and the weather could turn from clear to impenetrable in minutes. Malaria was rampant. Supplies were scarce. The airfields were mud strips carved out of jungle that flooded when it rained, which was often. And then there were the Japanese. Their pilots were experienced, having been at war since 1937 in China. They flew the Nimble Zero, a fighter that could turn on a dime and outmaneuver almost anything the Allies could put in the air. They were skilled, they were aggressive, and they were winning. On December 27, 1942, 2nd Lieutenant Richard Bong finally got his chance. Flying from Port Moresby, he was part of a mission over Buna, where Allied ground forces were locked in a desperate battle against entrenched Japanese Japanese positions. The sky erupted in combat. Japanese fighters swarmed the Allied formation. Tracers cut through the air like deadly threads. The radio filled with urgent calls, warnings, curses. In the chaos, Bong spotted a Zero closing on one of his wingmen. Everything he'd learned, all those hours of gunnery practice, all that time studying tactics, condensed into a few seconds of pure instinct. He dove on the Zero, closing the distance faster than the Japanese pilot could react. His finger found the trigger. The P-38's guns roared to life. The Zero disintegrated in midair, pieces tumbling toward the jungle below. Bong didn't have time to think about what he'd just done. Another enemy fighter, a Nakajima Oscar, appeared in his sights. Again, he fired. Again, his target fell from the sky. 2 confirmed victories in his first combat mission. The farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, had just become an ace in training, but more importantly, he'd discovered something about himself. In the cockpit, in combat, with his life and the lives of his fellow pilots on the line, he was completely, utterly calm. He'd found what he was born to do. The hunter emerges. Over the next months, Bong's reputation grew quietly but steadily. He wasn't loud about his successes. He didn't brag. After each mission, he'd fill out his report in the same methodical way he'd once cataloged farm equipment repairs back home. But the numbers spoke for themselves. By early 1943, when the 9th Fighter Squadron finally received their P-38 Lightnings, Bong was already developing the tactics and approaches that would make him legendary. He'd figured out something crucial about air combat in the Pacific. It wasn't about fancy maneuvers or aerobatic displays. It was about position, patience, and the willingness to get close enough to guarantee a hit. Bong had a secret that he rarely shared. He thought his gunnery skills were terrible. Where other pilots were content to fire from 300 or 400 yards away, Bong would close to 200 yards, sometimes less. He wanted to see his bullets hitting the target. He wanted to be close enough that missing was impossible. This approach was incredibly dangerous. At those ranges, debris from exploding enemy aircraft could damage his own plane. On several occasions, he flew through the wreckage of targets he'd just destroyed. Once he actually collided with an enemy aircraft, tearing pieces off both planes, and still managed to nurse his damaged P-38 back to base. His fellow pilots watched him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. In the air, the quiet farm boy became something else entirely. Aggressive, fearless, almost reckless. Yet he survived mission after mission, his victory count climbing steadily. One of his earliest mentors was Captain Thomas Lynch, an experienced pilot who took Bong under his wing. Lynch taught him advanced tactics, how to read enemy formations, how to exploit the P-38's strengths against the more maneuverable Zero. The two became a formidable team hunting Japanese aircraft across the skies of New Guinea. In January 1943, Allied intelligence reported a Japanese convoy attempting to bring reinforcements to New Guinea. The convoy was protected by fighters from the experienced 11th Sentai. Lynch led 8 P-38s, including Bong, to intercept. They found the convoy's air cover at 1:15 in the afternoon. 11 Japanese fighters, the P-38s, dove into them like wolves into a flock. Bong engaged a Nakajima Oscar in a turning fight that lasted 5 minutes, an eternity in air combat. The Japanese pilot was skilled, using his aircraft's superior maneuverability to avoid Bong's fire. But Bong was patient. He watched the Oscar's pattern, anticipated the next move, and when the Japanese pilot committed to a hard turn, Bong was there. The Oscar came apart under the P-38's concentrated fire. They refueled at Dobodura and went back up. At 3:30 p.m., they encountered 16 more enemy fighters near Leh. This time, Bong and his wingman, Lieutenant Plank, damaged 2 Oscars on their first pass. On the second pass, Bong destroyed one of them. 3 victories in a single day. His score was climbing, but more importantly, he was learning. Every engagement taught him something new about his aircraft, about enemy tactics, about the deadly calculus of air combat. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in early March 1943 was a turning point, not just in the war, but in Bong's development as a fighter pilot. Japanese transports were attempting to ferry nearly 7,000 reinforcements to New Guinea. Allied air forces attacked in waves, destroying transport after transport. Bong shot down a Zero, one of the most respected fighter aircraft in the Japanese arsenal. The battle was a devastating defeat for the Japanese and a propaganda victory for for the Allies. More importantly, it demonstrated that Allied pilots in modern aircraft with proper tactics could defeat even the experienced Japanese flyers who had dominated the Pacific skies for so long. By April 1943, Bong had been promoted to first lieutenant and had achieved double ace status with 10 confirmed victories. But the mission that would define his emerging legend was still coming. The impossible engagement. July 26, 1943, started like many other days in New Guinea, hot, humid, with clouds building over the jungle. Intelligence had reported Japanese aircraft operating near Leh. 10 P-38s, led by Bong, were tasked with finding and engaging them. They found more than they bargained for. At 14,000 feet, Bong's element spotted them first, a formation of 20 Japanese fighters, likely from the elite units that had been giving Allied pilots fits for months. The Japanese aircraft were in a tight, disciplined formation, their pilots confident, experienced, deadly. The smart play would have been to call for reinforcement, to wait for better odds. 10 against 20 were not good numbers, even with the P-38's advantages in speed and firepower. But Bong made a split-second decision that revealed everything about who he'd become. He attacked. The P-38s dove from altitude, engines screaming, building speed. The Japanese formation spotted them and began to maneuver, their fighters breaking into defensive pairs. What followed was a swirling, violent air battle that stretched across miles of sky. Bong's aircraft dove into the formation like a raptor among pigeons. He selected his first target, a Zero that was turning to engage another P-38, and close to killing range. His gun spoke, and the Zero exploded, pieces whirling away in the slipstream. Before the wreckage had finished falling, Bong was already repositioning. Another Zero crossed his nose. He fired a burst that caught the Japanese fighter in the engine. Smoke poured from the stricken aircraft as it nosed over into a death spiral. The Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns across China and the Pacific, had never seen anything like this. The tall American in the twin-engine fighter wasn't running. He wasn't trying to escape. He was hunting them in their own sky. A third enemy fighter made the mistake of crossing in front of Bong's P-38. He barely had to adjust his aim. A short burst, and the aircraft came apart, its pilot never knowing what hit him. A fourth Zero, trying to get on Bong's tail, instead found itself in his sights when he executed a violent maneuver that should have been impossible for an aircraft as large as the P-38. The Zero pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to realize his mistake before Bong's cannon shells tore through his cockpit. In less than 15 minutes of intense combat, Bong had personally destroyed 4 enemy aircraft. The remaining Japanese fighters, their formation shattered, broke off and fled. The Americans, incredibly, had won. When Bong landed back at base, his P-38 was riddled with holes. Hydraulic fluid dripped from severed lines. One engine was smoking. Ground crew gathered around, counting the bullet holes, shaking their heads in disbelief. Bong climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his hands still steady. When asked about the engagement, he shrugged and said something about getting lucky. 4 confirmed victories in a single mission wasn't luck. It was skill honed to a lethal edge. For this action, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration. But more important than any medal was what the mission represented. Bong had proven that aggressive tactics, superior positioning, and the willingness to engage against overwhelming odds could turn the tide of any engagement. The Japanese pilots who survived that day returned to their bases with stories of the American in the twin-engine fighter who fought like a demon. They had faced him 20-10 and been routed. It was a humiliation that would echo through their squadrons, a warning that the Americans were no longer the easy prey they'd been in the early months of the war. But for Bong, it was just another mission. He filed his report, checked his aircraft for the next day's operations, and wrote a letter home to Poplar, Wisconsin, where his family had no idea that their eldest son was becoming a legend. The race to history. By August 1943, Bong had been promoted to captain, and his victory total stood at an impressive 14, but what would come next would test him in ways combat never had. In November, General Kenney sent him back to the United States for a much-needed rest. The general had become something of a father figure to Bong, recognizing not just his skill, but his value as a symbol of American determination. Kenney knew that Bong was approaching Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 aerial victories, and he wanted his protege fresh for the push that would make history. The leave also had another purpose. The Army Air Force needed heroes, faces to put on recruiting posters, names to inspire the folks back home buying war bonds. Bong was perfect for this. Young, humble, successful, and most importantly, alive. It was during this leave that Bong attended a homecoming event at Superior State Teachers College. Among the crowd was a tall, dark-haired young woman named Marjorie Vattendahl. Friends called her Marge. She was teaching art at the college, and when she was introduced to the quiet pilot who'd come home a hero, something clicked. For Bong, who'd spent the last year living in primitive conditions and facing death daily, Marge represented everything he'd been fighting for: normalcy, beauty, home. For Marge, this shy war hero was unlike anyone she'd ever met. He didn't brag about his accomplishments. He seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. They started dating, and for a few precious weeks, Bong could pretend he was just a normal young man courting a girl in Wisconsin, not America's rising ace facing return to one of the war's most brutal theaters. But the war was still raging, and Bong's leave couldn't last forever. When he returned to the Pacific in early 1944, he carried with him a photograph of Marge and a determination to survive long enough to marry her. His new P-38J bore her name painted on the nose, along with her photograph. It wasn't just nose art. It was a promise. What followed was a period of almost superhuman achievement. Between January and April 1944, Bong added 23 more victories to his total, bringing his score to 28. He was flying constantly, pushing himself and his aircraft to the limit. On April 12, 1944, Bong shot down his 26th and 27th enemy aircraft. With those two victories, he surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's record that had stood for over 25 years. Richard Bong, the farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, was now officially the top American ace of all time. General Kenny immediately promoted him to major and sent him back to the United States. Rickenbacker himself met Bong and graciously congratulated him, the old ace passing the torch to the new. The media went wild. Bong's face appeared in newspapers across the country. He went on a 15-state war bond tour, speaking at training bases, shaking countless hands, enduring photo opportunities and ceremonies. But all he wanted was to get back to Marge and, paradoxically, back to combat. The publicity tour felt false to him. In the cockpit of his P-38, fighting for his life and the lives of his fellow pilots, everything was clear, simple, pure. Here, surrounded by cameras and reporters asking him to describe what it felt like to take another human life, nothing felt real. He proposed to Marge during this leave. She accepted. They planned to marry after the war ended, which everyone prayed would be soon. But Bong knew better. The Japanese were far from defeated, and there was still so much fighting ahead. The final hunt. In September 1944, Major Bong returned to the Pacific for what would be his final tour. His new assignment was as an advanced gunnery instructor with the V Fighter Command. On paper, he wasn't supposed to engage in combat. His job was to observe, to teach, to pass on the lessons he'd learned to the next generation of fighter pilots, but Bong had never been good at following orders he didn't agree with, and the idea of sitting on the sidelines while others fought was unbearable. On October 10, 1944, B-24 bombers were striking the Japanese oil refineries at Balikpapan, Borneo. It was an exceptionally dangerous mission, deep into enemy territory. 14 P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron provided escort. Bong, officially just an observer, was leading an element. During the mission, Japanese fighters attacked. Bong, defending himself, naturally shot down 2 of them. When General Kenny heard about it, he was furious. This wasn't self-defense. This was Bong being Bong, unable to resist the pull of combat. But Kenny couldn't stay mad. Bong's score now stood at 30. He was too valuable, too symbolic, and too close to an even more impressive milestone. Kenny made it clear, no more missions like Balikpapan. If Bong was going to keep flying, it had to be in safer circumstances. Bong nodded, agreed, and then kept doing exactly what he'd been doing. Between October and November, flying missions he technically shouldn't have been on, engaging enemies he was supposed to avoid, Bong added 8 more victories. His tactics hadn't changed. He still closed to point-blank range. He still flew through the debris of his targets. He still came back with his P-38 shot full of holes. On December 17, 1944, flying over the island of Mindoro in the Philippines, Bong spotted a Japanese fighter attempting to attack American positions. He dove on it, close to his preferred killing range, and fired. The enemy aircraft disintegrated. It was his 40th victory. Major Richard Ira Bong from Poplar, Wisconsin, population 300, had just become the highest-scoring American fighter ace in history, a record that still stands to this day. 40 confirmed aerial victories, over 200 combat missions, more than 500 hours of combat flying. 5 days later, on December 22nd, General Douglas MacArthur himself presented Bong with the Medal of Honor at Tacloban Airfield in the Philippines. MacArthur, never one for understatement, gave a speech that would be remembered. Major Richard Ira Bong, who has ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines, I now induct you into the society of the bravest of the brave, the wearers of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Bong stood at attention, the medal heavy on his chest, surrounded by the men he'd flown with, fought beside, and in some cases buried. He was 24 years old, and he'd been at war for 2 years. He'd seen friends perish, had felt bullets tear through his aircraft, had looked death in the face so many times it had become routine. But he'd also proven something fundamental about the American spirit. You didn't need to be from a big city or a prestigious family. You didn't need advantages or connections. A farm boy from the middle of nowhere, if he had the skill and the courage and the determination, could become the best in the world at what he did. General Kenny, who'd mentored Bong from the beginning, made the decision to send him home. 40 victories were enough. Over 200 missions were enough. It was time for Bong to live, to marry Marge, to have the future he'd been fighting for. In January 1945, Major Richard Bong left the Pacific Theater for the last time. Behind him, the war continued to rage. Ahead of him, he thought, was the life he'd always wanted, the price of speed. On February 10, 1945, Richard Bong and Marjorie Vattendahl were married in Superior, Wisconsin. 1,200 guests attended the ceremony, along with representatives from the international press. The shy farm boy and his bride were celebrities, symbols of American heroism and the hope of peace. They moved to California, where Bong had been assigned as a test pilot for Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. He would be testing the new P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. It was cutting-edge technology, the future of aviation. For Bong, who'd grown up fascinated by flight, who'd mastered the P-38 Lightning, the chance to fly jets seemed like a dream. But jet engines in 1945 were temperamental, unreliable, and dangerous. The technology was so new that every flight was essentially a test, every takeoff a gamble. August 6, 1945 started as a routine day. Bong was scheduled for an acceptance flight in a new P-80A, checking out the aircraft before it was delivered to the Air Force. Marge was at home, probably thinking about their plans for the evening, their life together, the children they'd someday have. At Burbank Airport, Bong completed his pre-flight checks. The P-80 was sleek, modern, nothing like the reliable, rugged P-38 he'd flown through 2 years of combat. But this was the future, and Bong had always been ready to embrace new challenges. The jet fighter rolled down the runway and lifted into the California sky. Witnesses said it climbed normally at first. Then, at about 300 feet, something went wrong. The fuel pump failed. The engine, starved of fuel, died instantly. Bong tried to restart. Nothing. He was too low to glide back to the runway, too low to safely maneuver. He did the only thing he could. He pulled the ejection handle. But jet ejection systems in 1945 were as experimental as the engines. The sequence didn't work properly. Bong separated from the aircraft, but his parachute never had time to deploy. He fell. The man who'd survived hundreds of combat missions, who'd faced death in the sky over the Pacific and always walked away, fell toward the California earth without any way to save himself. The P-80 crashed into a residential area in North Hollywood. Bong's body was found in a nearby field. He was 24 years old. He'd been married for less than 6 months. The same day, half a world away, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, beginning the end of the war Bong had fought so hard to win. The newspapers that announced the bombing also carried the news of America's greatest ace gone forever, a jarring reminder that even as the war was ending, it was still claiming heroes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Bong had survived combat against the most skilled enemy pilots, had flown through storms of anti-aircraft fire, had brought damaged aircraft home time and time again. But in the end, It was a mechanical failure in a routine test flight that took him. Legacy of a quiet hero. Bong was buried in his hometown of Poplar, Wisconsin, the same small farming community where he'd been born, where he'd learned to work hard and dream big, where his journey had begun. His funeral was attended by thousands. General Kenney gave the eulogy, remembering the shy farm boy who'd become the deadliest American fighter pilot in history. Marge, just 21 years old and a widow after 6 months of marriage, tried to build a new life. She eventually moved to Los Angeles, became a model, and later a magazine publisher. She never remarried. When she passed away in 2003, more than 58 years after Bong's death, she was buried beside him in Poplar. Today, Bong's legacy endures in numerous memorials. The Richard III Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, houses exhibits about his life, including a restored P-38 Lightning. The Richard III Bong Memorial Bridge spans the entrance to the twin ports of Duluth and Superior. There's a Richard III Bong Airport, a state recreation area, streets and schools bearing his name. But perhaps the most important legacy isn't found in monuments or museums. It's in the story itself, the improbable tale of a farm boy who became the best at what he did through skill, determination, and an unwavering commitment to his mission and his fellow pilots. Bong never sought glory. He never bragged about his achievements. When asked about his success, he would shrug and say he was just lucky. The Japanese fighters happened to get in his way. But luck doesn't account for 40 confirmed aerial victories. Luck doesn't explain how a pilot could face overwhelming odds again and again and consistently emerge victorious. What Bong had was something deeper, a combination of natural talent honed by relentless practice, tactical brilliance tempered by farm boy common sense, and courage that never wavered, even when the odds seemed impossible. The Japanese pilots who faced him, especially in those early engagements when they still had numerical superiority, and experienced pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. This lone American, this farm boy in his twin-engine fighter, was outflying them, outfighting them, defeating formations of experienced pilots through pure skill and audacity. Those who flew with Bong remember him as quiet on the ground, almost invisible in a crowd. But in the cockpit, he transformed. He became aggressive, fearless, almost reckless in his pursuit of enemy aircraft. Yet he was also calculating, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always positioning himself for the kill shot before his enemies realized the trap had been set. His approach to gunnery, closing to point-blank range because he doubted his own shooting ability, became legendary. Most pilots wouldn't dare get that close. The risk of collision, of flying through debris, of being caught in the explosion of their own target was too great. But Bong saw it differently. Getting close eliminated variables. At 200 yards or less, there was no guessing about deflection angles, no wondering if the enemy would break before the bullets arrived. At that range, if you aimed at them, you hit them. This philosophy extended to his overall approach to combat. He didn't believe in fair fights. He attacked from advantage, used the sun and clouds for cover, struck hard and fast before the enemy could react. But he also knew when to break off, when the odds turned too far against him, when survival was more important than another kill. That wisdom, that ability to balance aggression with pragmatism, was rare among fighter pilots. Many aces were aggressive to the point of recklessness, racking up victories until their luck ran out. Bong was aggressive when it mattered, cautious when it counted. He survived 2 full years of intense combat, not through luck, but through judgment. The fact that he volunteered to return to combat again and again, even when he'd been assigned to safer duties, speaks to his character. He could have sat out the final months of the war as an instructor, safely training the next generation. His record was secure. His fame was established, but he couldn't do it. While men he'd trained were in the sky fighting and dying, he felt obligated to be there with them. That sense of duty, inherited from parents who'd built a life through hard work and honesty, who'd taught him that when something needed doing, you did it yourself, defined Bong's entire military career. He never asked others to do what he wouldn't do. He led from the front literally, flying as element or flight leader rather than commanding from behind. The farm boy's final lesson. The story of Richard Bong is, at its heart, a quintessentially American story. It's about potential realized, about ordinary origins leading to extraordinary achievement. In a nation built on the idea that anyone can rise through merit and effort, Bong embodied that promise. He didn't have advantages. He wasn't from wealth or privilege. He grew up in a town so small that most Americans had never heard of it and never would. His education came from rural schools and a state teachers' college. His early training was on farm equipment and hunting in the woods. Yet when his country called, when the test came, he proved to be exactly what was needed. The same patience he'd learned waiting for deer in the North Woods served him in combat, allowing him to wait for the perfect shot. The mechanical knowledge gained from keeping farm equipment running translated directly to understanding and maximizing his aircraft's performance. The quiet confidence born from solving problems on his own made him decisive in combat when hesitation meant death. In many ways, Bong's background was his greatest advantage. He hadn't been taught that some things were impossible. He hadn't learned to doubt himself or to assume that others knew better. When faced with 20 enemy fighters, he didn't think about doctrine or what the manual said. He thought about the mission, about protecting his fellow pilots, and about the fact that he had the skill and the aircraft to win that fight. And he did win. Not just that fight, but fight after fight, mission after mission, for 2 years of brutal combat, 40 victories, hundreds of missions, thousands of hours in hostile skies. The Japanese pilots who survived encounters with him carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Some later recounted the experience of fighting this lone American who seemed to be everywhere at once, who attacked when he should have retreated, who closed to ranges that seemed suicidal, yet somehow always emerged victorious. They'd been told they were superior, that their training and experience made them unbeatable. Then they met Bong, and their assumptions shattered like their aircraft under his guns. For American pilots, Bong was proof that they could win. In the early days of the Pacific War, when the Japanese seemed invincible, when losses mounted and victories were rare, Bong showed what was possible. His success gave others hope and provided a model to emulate. His tactics were studied, his approaches copied, his aggressive yet calculated style influencing an entire generation of fighter pilots. General Kenny, who'd mentored Bong from the beginning, later wrote an entire book about him, titled Dick Bong, Ace of Aces. In it, Kenny described Bong as the perfect fighter pilot, skilled but humble, aggressive but smart, fearless but not reckless. Kenny believed that Bong's farm background was central to his success, that the values learned in rural Wisconsin made him the pilot he became. Perhaps that's the final lesson of Richard Bong's story. Greatness can come from anywhere. It doesn't require perfect circumstances or ideal preparation. Sometimes the best training for extraordinary challenges is ordinary life lived with integrity, hard work, and a commitment to doing your best regardless of the task. The farm boy who left Poplar, Wisconsin in 1941 came home in 1945 a hero, a legend, and tragically too soon in a flag-draped coffin. But in the brief time he had, he made an impact that resonates 8 decades later. Every time someone visits the Bong Heritage Center and sees that restored P-38, every time a student learns about America's top ace, every time a young person from a small town dares to dream big, Richard Bong's legacy continues. He proved that where you come from matters less than who you choose to be. That quiet competence can be more powerful than loud bravado. That duty and service transcend self-interest. And that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who never sought to be heroes at all. The Japanese pilots who faced him couldn't believe a lone farm boy was outflying all 40 of them. But those who knew Dick Bong weren't surprised at all. They'd seen the quiet determination, the relentless practice, the unwavering commitment. They knew that behind the shy smile and humble demeanor was a will of iron and a skill honed to perfection. In the end, Richard Ira Bong did exactly what he set out to do. He served his country with distinction. He protected his fellow pilots. He became the best in the world at what he did, and he did it all while remaining true to the values he learned on that small farm in northern Wisconsin. His 40 victories stand as a record that may never be broken, not because modern pilots lack skill, but because the nature of warfare has changed. The era of the fighter race, of individual pilots engaging in dogfights that decided the course of battles, has largely passed. Bong lived and fought in a unique moment in history when one person in one aircraft could make a measurable difference in the outcome of a war. And he made that difference, mission after mission, victory after victory, until the final tally reached a number that seemed impossible to those who'd known the quiet boy working the family farm. 40. 40 enemy aircraft destroyed. 40 times Dick Bong closed to point-blank range and pulled the trigger. 40 times he bet his life that his skill would overcome the enemy's numbers or experience or maneuverability. 40 times he won that bet. The farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, population 300, proved that American excellence could emerge from the most humble origins. In doing so, he became not just a war hero, but an enduring symbol of what's possible when talent meets opportunity, when determination refuses to accept defeat, and when quiet courage speaks louder than any boast. That's why his story matters, not just as history, not just as a tale of military achievement, but as a reminder that greatness can come from anywhere, that the next person to change the world might be learning their most important lessons on a farm in the middle of nowhere, looking up at the sky and dreaming of flight. Dick Bong proved that dreams backed by determination can take you anywhere, can help you achieve anything, can turn the impossible into merely difficult, and the difficult into accomplished fact. He flew, he fought, he won, and he did it all in a way that made his small hometown proud, his country grateful, and his enemies respectful. The farm boy who became America's greatest ace, the quiet hero who let his actions speak louder than words, the pilot who proved that where you start matters far less than how hard you're willing to work to reach your destination. That is the legacy of Richard Ira Bong. That is why 80 years later we still tell his story, and that is why it will continue to be told for generations to come.